ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਰੇਡੀਓ USA ਸੁਣ ਰਹੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਹਿਮਾਂਜੋਕ ਅਤੇ ਸਤਿਕਾਰਤ ਸਰੋਤਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਪਿਆਰ ਸਤਿਕਾਰ ਸਹਿਤ ਨਿੱਘੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਸਤਿ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਸਭ ਨੂੰ ਜੀਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ। ਸੋ ਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਫਾਰਮਿੰਗ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਹਾਜ਼ਰ ਹੋ ਚੁੱਕੇ ਹਾਂ। ਸੋ ਅੱਜ ਆਪਣੇ ਨਾਲ UCANR ਤੋਂ ਜੁੜਨਗੇ ਐਲਿਜ਼ਾਬeth ਫਿਚਨਰ, ਜੋ ਕਿ ਆਪਣੇ ਨਾਲ ਅੱਜ ਓਲਿਵ ਫਾਰਮਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਕਰਨਗੇ। ਸੋ ਸਾਡੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਆ ਮੋਸਟਲੀ ਇੰਗਲਿਸ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੋਊਗੀ, ਪਰ ਮੈਂ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰੂੰਗਾ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਾਲ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਆ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਵੱਧ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਆ ਉਸਨੂੰ ਮੈਂ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਟਰਾਂਸਲੇਟ ਕਰਕੇ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੱਕ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਪਹੁੰਚਾ ਸਕਾਂ। ਸੋ ਰਾਈਟ ਨਾਓ we have Elizabeth Fichtner with us from UCANR. Hi, Elizabeth. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Can you tell a little bit about yourself before we get into the olive farming?
Oh, sure. I'm actually from New York originally, but I live in the southern Central Valley of California right now. But I'm originally from New York, and I'm from a town that was it's known as Hicksville, Long Island, and it's a dominantly Indian community. So a lot of my high school friends' parents might be listening to this show because I said, "You're going to see I'm on Punjabi radio," which is kind of
That's
fun.
awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's nice. So you've been working with the UC for how long now?
Well, I've been with the University of California for 21 years because I started on campus at UC Davis as a postdoc, and I was working on sudden oak death, which is a disease of forests, and I was working here and in the UK because we had some similar diseases in England and California. And then after I did that work for 6 years, I got this job as a farm advisor with UCANR, and I moved to Tulare County.
Oh, wow. So she has done PhD, MS, and BS in plant science, plant pathology, and soil science. I think you did it from North Carolina State University at the time.
Yep, I was in North Carolina and then California.
Yeah. So ਦੱਸ ਜਾਈਏ, so Elizabeth Fichtner ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ University of California ਦੇ Agriculture and Natural Resources UCANR ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕੰਮ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਆ। ਪਿਛਲੇ 21 ਸਾਲ ਤੋਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ UC ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕੰਮ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ। ਵੱਖ-ਵੱਖ ਡਿਜ਼ੀਜ਼ਸ ਤੇ ਵੱਖ-ਵੱਖ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਐਕਸਪਰਟੀਜ਼ ਆ ਏਰੀਆ ਦੀ। ਸੋ ਅੱਜ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਥੋੜੀ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਇਸ ਬਾਬਤ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। So how long you've been working on olives? How long has that been your area of expertise?
So when I moved to Tulare County, my position covers, and this was 16 years ago, my position covers the nut crops, pistachio, almond, pecan, walnut, but also prunes and olives. And so I've been working on olives for 16 years. And I do a lot of work on olives in part because there's so few people working in olives. There's a lot of almond expertise, but not so much olive.
Yeah. So olives are a bit neglected, but we like them on the pizzas and many other places as well. So how big of a crop is olive in California?
Well, there's about 32,000 acres of olives in California. That's according to the National Ag Statistical Service. And it's really the only state in the US that has a notable amount of olives. I mean, there's some plantings in Arizona. And for a while, there was a fledgling olive oil industry in Florida. But really, by and large, all of the olives that are grown in the United States are grown here in California. It's a big industry. The gross value is about $160 billion, varying on the year.
So that's a big number. So which are the places where in California, which counties which are mostly dedicated to olives?
So about 75% of just the value alone comes from 5 counties. The number one would be Tehama County, in the north, kind of at the top of the Sacramento Valley, followed by Glen, Tulare, Yolo, and San Joaquin. Tulare County, where I'm located, has the highest percent of the total acreage, and it's been a historic center of table olive production.
Okay. So it means there are obviously there are multiple varieties of olive, just like grapes. Some are table grapes, some are wine grapes. So there are table olives, and then there is olive oil. Those two are like different things.
Yeah, and in a way, they're almost different crops because the oil growers tend to be different growers than the table olive growers. And so for oil olives, there'll be several varieties that are grown. There's Italian varieties and Greek ones and Spanish ones. And growers might grow several varieties so that the oils can be blended, because they make flavor profiles of the oil.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas table olives are really only one variety, Manzanillo, and they're interplanted with Sevillano, which are kind of the larger olives. They call them queens, and they're really used as pollinizers for the Manzanillo.
Hmm. Okay. So as you're mentioning, just I'll recap in Punjabi whatever you told me so far.
Sure.
Yeah. ਸੋ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਇਹ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਐਲਿਜ਼ਾਬeth ਡਾਕਟਰ ਐਲਿਜ਼ਾਬeth ਫਿਚਨਰ ਵੀ ਤਕਰੀਬਨ 32,000 ਏਕੜ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਐਗਰੀਕਲਚਰ ਸਟੈਟਿਸਟਿਕ ਸਰਵਿਸ ਆ ਉਹਦੇ ਹਿਸਾਬ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਓਲਿਵ ਆ ਉਹ ਇੱਥੇ ਗਰੋ ਕੀਤੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ ਕੈਲੀਫੋਰਨੀਆ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਹਦ ਸੂਬਾ ਆ ਯੂਐਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਆ ਉਹ ਗਰੋ ਕੀਤੇ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਇੱਕ ਟਾਈਮ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਐਰੀਜ਼ੋਨਾ 'ਚ ਵੀ ਹੋਏ ਫਲੋਰੀਡਾ 'ਚ ਵੀ ਹੋਏ ਪਰ ਮੋਸਟਲੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਆ 160 ਬਿਲੀਅਨ ਡਾਲਰ ਦੀ 160 ਬਿਲੀਅਨ ਡਾਲਰ ਦੀ ਇਹ ਇੰਡਸਟਰੀ ਆ ਕੈਲੀਫੋਰਨੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਦੀ 75% ਜਿਹੜੀ ਵੈਲਿਊ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਦੀ ਟਿਹਾਮਾ ਗਲੈਨ ਟੁਲੈਰੀ ਯੋਲੋ ਸੈਨ ਵਕੀਨ ਕਾਊਂਟੀ ਤੋਂ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਆ ਤੇ ਟੁਲੈਰੀ ਕਾਊਂਟੀ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਹਾਈਐਸਟ ਪਰਸੈਂਟੇਜ ਆ ਏਕੜੇਜ ਦੇ ਹਿਸਾਬ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਟੇਬਲ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਆ ਉਹ ਵੱਧ ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਬਾਕੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਟੇਬਲ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਓਲਿਵ ਆਇਲ ਵਾਲੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਆਫ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਟ ਆਰਚਰਡਸ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਟ ਗਰੋਇੰਗ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਸੋ ਟੇਬਲ ਓਲਿਵ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਮੈਨਜ਼ੈਨੀਲੋ ਇਹ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਪੋਲਿਨਾਈਜ਼ਰਸ ਦੇ ਤੌਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਡਿਫਰੈਂਟ ਵੈਰਾਈਟੀ ਨੂੰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਵਰਤਿਆ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਆ ਸੋ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਐਲਿਜ਼ਾਬeth so olives were these native to US or did we brought it from someplace?
Oh, they have such a deep history. Actually, they're native to Asia Minor, and genetic studies just that were completed a few years ago were able to narrow down their center of origin to the border of Syria and Turkey. In about 3000 BC, they were traded around the Mediterranean region.
Wow.
They were brought to the New World, first to Peru by Spanish explorers in the late 1500s.
Mhm.
And then the Jesuits brought them to Mexico and Baja California in the 1700s. So they have quite a long history. And then the history in California then dates to the missions. The Franciscans brought them to California in the late 1700s, and then they were established at the mission in San Diego. And those trees that are at the mission in San Diego, and the trees are still there actually, they provided the nursery propagative material that led to the whole development of the California olive industry.
ਸੋ ਵੈਰੀ ਇੰਟਰਸਟਿੰਗ ਸੋ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਦੱਸਦੇ ਵੀ ਤਕਰੀਬਨ 5000 ਸਾਲ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਵੀ 3000 BC ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ 3000 BC ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਉੱਥੇ ਸੀਰੀਆ ਟਰਕੀ ਦੇ ਬਾਰਡਰ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਏਸ਼ੀਆ ਮਾਈਨਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਸੋ ਇੱਥੇ ਵੈਸਟਰਨ ਵਾਲੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਾਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਬੇਸਿਕਲੀ ਸਪੈਨਿਸ਼ ਐਕਸਪਲੋਰਰਸ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਆਏ ਸੀ ਜਦੋਂ 1500s ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਲਿਆਂਦੇ ਫਿਰ ਮੈਕਸੀਕੋ ਬਾਹਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ 1700s ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਏ ਕੈਲੀਫੋਰਨੀਆ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਲੇਟ 1700s 'ਚ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਐਂਟਰੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਕੀਤੀ ਆ ਸੋ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਓਲਿਵ ਆਇਲ ਇੰਡਸਟਰੀ ਸੀਗੀ 1800s ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਫਿਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਟੇਬਲ ਓਲਿਵ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਹਿ ਲਓ ਵੀ ਇੰਡਸਟਰੀ ਆ ਉਹ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੱਧ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਹੋਈ ਆ Elizabeth, when you were talking about 32,000 acres of olives, are these both table olives and olive oil industry combined?
Yes, that's the total of both because the ag statistics don't break it down for you to in terms of oil versus table. And there
Mhm.
are some varieties actually that are used for both. So for example, Manzanillo olive is the table olive variety that's used for the black ripe canning olives, but they also make really good oil. And so if the prices are down for table olives, some growers will opt to use Manzanillo olives to make olive oil.
Okay. What are usually the prices going on right now? Are they per bin? Are they per acre or per pound? How does that work in this
You
industry?
know, I don't know what the prices are right now. There's like a bargaining organization. I'm trying to think of their name. They're located out of here, down the southern San Joaquin Valley. So there's a group of growers that will negotiate the prices with the canners. There are two canners in California. One is Musco and the other is Bell Carter. And they both process the olives into black ripe olives.
Okay. What kind of soil does olive farming prefer?
Oh, that's such a good question. You know, olives are they're easy to grow in even really bad soil, you know,
Hmm.
and so they can handle lower quality soils. But of course, the better you treat them, the more productive they will be. If you look at the olive growing region in Tulare County, for example, they're in really good soil, but they historically were grown by citrus growers.
Uh,
And the olives were planted in just the cooler areas that were a little too cool for citrus. Because although olives are sensitive to frost, they're much more tolerant than citrus. And so a lot of them are grown in really good quality soils, you know, that are also, oh, well, when table olives, when orchards are taken out, a lot of them have gone into pistachio production, for example.
hmm, hmm, hmm. Okay. So pretty interesting. So ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਇਹ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਤਕਰੀਬਨ ਹਰ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆ ਸੋਇਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਈਵਨ ਬੈਡ ਸੋਇਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਚੱਲ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਵਧੀਆ ਨਾ ਵੀ ਹੋਵੇ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਠੰਡ ਥੋੜੀ ਜੀ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ ਸਿਟਰਸ ਵਾਲੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਮੋਸਟਲੀ ਉਹ ਇੱਥੇ ਲਾਉਂਦੇ ਆ ਜਿੱਥੇ ਕੋਰਾ ਕੂਰਾ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਪੈ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਥੋੜੇ ਜਿਹਾ ਮੋਰ ਟੋਲਰੈਂਟ ਨੇ ਕੋਰੇ ਨੂੰ ਠੰਡ ਨੂੰ ਰਾਦਰ ਦੈਨ ਸਿਟਰਸ ਸੋ ਉੱਥੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਵਰਤਿਆ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਆ ਸੋ ਇੱਕ ਦੋ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਕੈਨਰਸ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ ਇੱਥੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹ ਕੰਮ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ how much water usually olives take? What's the requirements for that? Because right now in California, there are many places where water is not that abundant anymore. So, what's the criteria for water for irrigation with this?
Oh gosh, I wish I had known. I would have looked it up right before this, but I don't, I just can't tell you a number off the top of my head in terms of like acre feet.
Comparatively to almonds or pistachios, is it higher
So
or lower?
they're much more drought tolerant
Okay.
than the nut crops, you know. And the challenge with olives are that, you know, in a lot of European countries, they are grown as a dry land crop, so they're not irrigated. But of course, that's true for almonds too. There's a lot of dry land almond cultivation in Spain, for example. They just don't produce as much. So that's really the main thing is if you're irrigating, you can get a higher production.
Oh, okay. So, what are the major diseases or pests which olive industry have to deal with?
Well, the olive industry, whether you're a table olive grower or an oil grower, the pests and diseases are the same. There might just be some threshold differences.
Okay.
So a good example to start with is olive fruit fly, because that was an introduced invasive pest. Um, if you imagine the olive fruit fly, they oviposit on the fruit so that the fruit will have larvae in it.
Mhm.
And for oil, a little bit of larvae in your fruit at harvest is not that big of a deal. The olives are macerated and the oil is extracted. So there's a higher threshold for olive fruit fly in the oil olives. But for a table olive, there's a zero tolerance imposed by the canners because no one wants to open up a can of olives and find larvae inside. And so,
Okay.
although the pest affects both, it's certainly more of a problem for table olives.
Hmm. So, are these pests or diseases overlapping with other crops as well, or they are entirely different a class of for olives?
Okay, so for olive fruit fly, it's just a pest on olive. It doesn't go to other crops. So another disease that's worthy of mention, that's probably the worst olive disease, is olive knot. It's caused by a bacterium. That affects olives specifically and oleander because oleander is a close relative to olive.
Okay. So these olive flies you are talking about, is that been here historically, or has that been here recently?
Um, I'm trying to think. I would say just over 20 years.
Okay. So since 1800s, not that much, but now recently, you'll say since
Yeah,
2000s.
since around the year 2000, it was introduced from Africa.
Hmm. How bad is the pressure this year?
The pressure does not appear that bad. We're doing some research on this right now.
Okay.
Um, so the heat really reduces
Yeah.
the risk for olive fruit fly. And so when you have the heat like we did this year, it'll suppress the populations. What my research team has been working on is taking historical olive fruit fly trapping data because we have over 20 years worth of weekly trapping data from
Okay.
the olive growing season.
Mhm.
So, and this has been funded by the California Olive Committee, and they made the data available to us. So what we're doing is taking those historic olive fruit fly trap counts and trying to correlate it with weather data so we can look at trends and expectations of what might happen in a warming climate. But also, we're trying to develop a predictive model that a grower can use, just based on the weather parameters, what would be the predicted outcome of whether or not there would be a risk of olive fruit fly, um, just like on a Google platform. And so that one could time insecticide applications to when the risk is highest.
Okay. ਓਕੇ ਸੋ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਦੱਸਦੇ ਜਾਵਾਂ ਜੋ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਓਲਿਵ ਫਲਾਈ ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਓਲਿਵ ਨੋਟ ਕਰਕੇ ਓਲਿਵ ਨੋਟ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਬੈਕਟੀਰੀਆ ਕਰਕੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਆਉਂਦੀ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਨੁਕਸਾਨਦੇਹ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ ਓਲਿਵ ਨੂੰ ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਓਲਿਵ ਫਲਾਈ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕਿ 2000s ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਥੇ ਇੰਟਰੋਡਿਊਸ ਹੋਏ ਸੀ ਅਫਰੀਕਾ ਤੋਂ ਆਏ ਸੀ ਤੇ ਉਹ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਸਭ ਤੋਂ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਆ ਤੇ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਆਪਾਂ ਚੀਜ਼ ਇਹ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਦੋਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕੈਨ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ ਔਰ ਟੇਬਲ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਿਸੇ ਵੀ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦਾ ਕੋਈ ਥ੍ਰੈਸ਼ਹੋਲਡ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਲਾਰਵੀ ਦਾ ਫਲਾਈ ਦਾ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਵੀ ਜਦੋਂ ਖੋਲੋ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਲਾਰਵੀ ਨਿਕਲੇ ਤੇਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਝ ਹਿੱਸਾ ਕਹਿ ਸਕਦੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਥੋੜਾ ਬਹੁਤਾ ਕਿਤੇ ਕਿਤੇ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਥ੍ਰੈਸ਼ਹੋਲਡ ਆ ਉਹ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਆ ਸੋ ਕੁਝ ਵੈਰਾਈਟੀਆਂ ਇਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆ ਇੱਕ ਓਲੀਐਂਡਰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਫੁੱਲ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਵੀ ਉਹ ਸੇਮ ਓਲਿਵ ਨੋਟ ਵਾਲੀ ਪ੍ਰੋਬਲਮ ਆ ਸਕਦੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੀ ਆ ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਓਲਿਵ ਦੀਆਂ ਪੈਸਟ ਆ ਫਲਾਈ ਤੇ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਓਲਿਵ ਨੋਟ ਆ ਇਹ ਬਾਕੀ ਹੋਰ ਨਟ ਕ੍ਰੌਪਸ ਨੂੰ ਇਫੈਕਟ ਨਹੀਂ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈਗਾ so what kind of climate does olive mostly like as you mentioned before it's drought resistant and it can handle some chill as well so what's the season look like for olive farming
Well, it's interesting because Well, olives were, before coming to California, they were planted in Mexico and Baja California. But that latitude is just not best for olives because there's not enough chill. So in those warmer environments, we get nice vegetative growth. They
Mhm.
can serve as ornamentals, but they're not going to produce fruit. And so we do need a chill. There's a chill requirement. And that's why they do so well in the San Joaquin Valley. There are olives that are grown in Tehachapi. Those those plantings are for oil, and I think that's and there's also some in the Imperial Valley for oil. And one of the risks for those like more southern locations is a lack of chill, and that could certainly affect olive productivity and impact the alternate bearing cycle of olives.
ਓਕੇ ਸੋ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਵੀ ਬੜੇ ਖੁਸ਼ਕ ਇਲਾਕੇ 'ਚ ਗਰਮ ਇਲਾਕੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਓਲਿਵ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਉਦਾਂ ਟਰੀ ਵੱਡਾ ਹੋ ਜਾਊਗਾ ਗਰੋਥ ਦੂਜੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਹੋ ਜਾਊਗੀ ਬਟ ਇੰਨੀ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਸੋ ਥੋੜੇ ਠੰਡੇ ਇਲਾਕੇ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਪਸੰਦ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ ਪਰ ਫਿਰ ਵੀ ਟੇਹਾਚਪੀ ਤੇ ਇੰਪੀਰੀਅਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਾਉਂਟੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਦੇਖੇ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਸੋ ਟੁਲੇਰੀ ਇਜ਼ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਆਫ ਸਾਊਥ ਟੂ ਅਸ so but we don't see much olives over here in Fresno County as well. Is there a reason for that, or it's just because of almonds mostly?
I think it's really just a historical thing. So, and when I say historical, that they were planted here in Tulare County, and then we had a big canner here in Lindsay, in Tulare County, and now they're not. There's no processor processing olives in Tulare County, so the crop that's grown here is shipped to processors, one in the Bay Area and one in the Sacramento Valley. But I think it's just historic. It's just because there used to be Lindsay olive in the area, and it's such an old historic crop in the region.
Hmm. I think Corning is a city. I think called City of Olives or something.
Yes, it is. It is.
So it's up north over there near Reading. You go up north, so over there. So nice.
And there's a lot of new plantings up there. There's a lot of plantings in the Sacramento Valley, and there's a lot in San Joaquin County, and
Mhm.
they're relatively new. This was all um, uh, olives for oil, and they're grown so different than the historic table olives. These new plantings are grown in super high density, and so
Mm.
you have a lot of trees per acre. And
Oh,
they're on a trellis system. You see them planted somewhat similar to grapes. They'll use
okay.
an over the row harvester that they use for grapes, but to harvest the olives. This works out really well for oil olives because damage doesn't matter because they're
Mm.
going to get macerated. Whereas table olives, the cost of harvesting is the main issue for the sustainability of that industry because
Ah.
they still tend to be harvested by hand.
Oh wow! So that's a big effort. You need it's labor intensive. Then you need to have that. So how much more? As you told that these oil olives could be planted more. How much more per acre you can plant for olive oils? Do you have any idea? Any number here?
Oh my goodness. Of course I would, but I don't have it off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I would have looked it up for you. Um,
How,
but
how,
they're planted kind of like a vineyard would be. You know, they're planted
that,
at high numbers per acre.
so that is pretty dense then. Yeah.
It's an intense system. Yeah.
So, in a year, if you can tell us like how the cycle goes for olive, because a lot of our listeners they are not aware when do they bloom, when is the harvesting done. If you can touch on that.
Sure. So olives, first of all, they're evergreen. I mean we know that, but we don't always think about it. They're so different than the nut crops that are all deciduous.
Hmm.
So with olives, they bloom in late April or early May.
Okay.
And around the very beginning of July is when you can assess the fruit set, and that's when pit hardening starts. Um, they grow through the summer, and the major time of vegetative growth is in the heat of the summer. That's when they're putting on the majority of their vegetative growth. Table olives tend to be harvested, I would say, mid to late September through October.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing, like, that's really key, is table olives are harvested when they're physiologically immature,
Hmm.
so they're not really ripe.
Ah.
So so they're still green when you pick them.
Hmm.
The oil olives are harvested when they're ripe, and they stay on the trees into November. And some of the coastal areas that grow olives might still be harvesting into January. They just keep on going because they're not really trying to achieve yield of fruit, it's yield of oil, and the oil content goes up like later in the year.
ਸੋ ਆਪਣੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਰੋਤਿਆਂ ਦਰਸ਼ਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਲਈ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਦੱਸ ਜਾਈਏ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਦੀ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਅਪ੍ਰੈਲ ਮਈ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਬਲੂਮ ਕਰਦਾ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਟੇਬਲ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਆ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਕਾਸ਼ਤ ਯੂਜਲੀ ਸਤੰਬਰ ਤੱਕ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹ ਹੋ ਜਾਂਦੀ ਉਹ ਕੱਚੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਤੋੜਦੇ ਆ ਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਤੇਲ ਵਾਲੇ ਓਲਿਵ ਆ ਉਹ ਨਵੰਬਰ ਤੱਕ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹ ਚਲੇ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ ਸੋ ਇਸ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੋਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਵੱਖੋ ਵੱਖਰੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕਾਸ਼ਤ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਆ ਤੇ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਦੱਸਦੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਅਪ ਨਾਰਥ ਵੀ ਹੁਣ ਕਾਫੀ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਓਲਿਵ ਦੀ ਨਵੀਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਪਲਾਂਟੇਸ਼ਨ ਆ ਉਹ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਆ ਤੇ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਗ੍ਰੇਪ ਲੱਗਦੇ ਆ ਉਦਾਂ ਹੀ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਓਲਿਵ ਹੁਣ ਟ੍ਰੈਲਸ ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹ ਲਾਏ ਜਾ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਲਾਗੇ ਲਾਗੇ ਲੱਗਦੇ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਖਾਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਤੇਲ ਵਾਲੇ ਆ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਟੇਬਲ ਟਾਪ ਓਲਿਵਸ ਆ ਉਹ ਅਜੇ ਵੀ ਉਸੇ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਨਾਲ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਵਾਂਗੂ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਦੂਰ ਦੂਰ ਆ ਉਹ ਲੱਗਦੇ ਆ ਹਾਊ ਲੌਂਗ ਇਜ਼ ਦ ਲਾਈਫ ਆਫ ਏ ਓਲਿਵ ਟਰੀ ਯੂਜਲੀ
They just keep on going. They just keep on going. So there's not really an answer to that.
Wow.
The first harvest might be after about 5 years, kind of similar to walnuts, for example.
Okay.
Not as bad as pistachio, which is more like 6 years, 7 years. But they but the older orchards are still productive. There's not really an end of life.
Does the production level decreases by the year, the maturity, the oldness?
No, production really doesn't decrease. There's more, I would say, challenges in terms of managing tree size for harvestability. I mean, that's one of the challenges, because the trees can get really big, and if you have people in trees with ladders, that's a challenge. And some of the new research is on mechanical harvest techniques, and we have UC engineers working on that, like Riza Asani at UC Merced. And, some of those techniques, the mechanical harvesting techniques may be more limiting as trees get bigger. If you're relying on vibrations from shaking, traveling through the tree. So those are kind of more important factors, are things like harvestability and also just management of the crop. Yeah.
ਸੋ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਇਹ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਆ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਚੱਲਦੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ, ਸੋ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਆਫ ਬੁੜੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੁੰਦੇ, ਕਰਦੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਤੇ ਜਿੰਨਾ ਚਿਰ ਮਰਜੀ 5 ਸਾਲ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਚ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਵੀ ਇਹ ਪਹਿਲਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਉਹ ਕ੍ਰੌਪ ਆ ਉਹ ਦੇਣਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰਦੇ ਆ, ਪਹਿਲੀ ਵਾਰੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਸ ਤੋਂ ਹਾਰਵੈਸਟਿੰਗ ਇਸ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੈਗੇ ਆ। ਸੋ Elizabeth, we'll take a short break over here, and when we come back, we'll talk about that alternate brewing cycle of olives, why it is, and what kind of research you guys are doing to mitigate it. So we'll
sounds good.
talk about it. So ਸਲੋਤੋ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜਿਹੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਮੁੜਦੇ ਆ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਐਲਿਜ਼ਾਬੈਥ ਫਿਚਨਰ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਇਦਾਂ ਹੀ ਜਾਰੀ ਰਹੇਗੀ। ਆਪ ਸਭ ਦਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ ਸੋਤੋ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਇਸ ਟਾਈਮ ਚੱਲ ਰਿਹਾ ਜੀ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਫਾਰਮਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅੱਜ ਮੇਰੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੇ ਹੋਏ ਨੇ ਡਾਕਟਰ ਐਲਿਜ਼ਾਬੈਥ ਫਿਚਨਰ ਜੋ ਕਿ olive ਐਕਸਪਰਟ ਨੇ ਵੈਲਕਮ ਟੂ ਦ ਸ਼ੋ ਵਾਂਸ ਅਗੇਨ ਵੈਲਕਮ ਬੈਕ ਐਲਿਜ਼ਾਬੈਥ
Thank you.
ਤੇ ਨਾਲ ਹੀ ਦੱਸ ਜੀ ਸਾਡੇ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਅਪਡੇਟ ਫਾਰਮਿੰਗ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਤੱਕ ਪਹੁੰਚਾਉਣ 'ਚ ਸਹਿਯੋਗ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਸਪਾਂਸਰ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ ਜਸਪੀਰ ਸਿੰਘ ਨਿੱਜਰ ਜੀ ਟ੍ਰੇਸੀ ਤੋਂ ਹਾਰਵੀ ਨੇਜਰ ਕ੍ਰੌਪ ਇੰਸ਼ੋਰੈਂਸ ਵਾਲੇ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਕੋਲੋਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਹਰ ਤਰੀਕੇ ਦੀ ਕ੍ਰੌਪ ਇੰਸ਼ੋਰੈਂਸ ਕਰਵਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ ਕਾਲ ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ 5592881908 ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਦਾ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੀ ਇਸ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਨੂੰ ਸਪਾਂਸਰ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦੇ ਹੋ ਸੰਪਰਕ ਕਰੋ 408 722 7698 ਦੇ ਉੱਤੇ Dr. Elizabeth Fichtner, so you were talking about alternate bearing in olive. Can you explain that phenomena? Is that how olives have always been doing?
Well, olives are not alone in this, but like pistachios alternate bear as well. And alternate bearing means that the trees will produce a heavy crop one year and then a light crop the next year. And you have to like adjust your farming management practices around this alternate bearing. It creates a real problem with olives because in an on year, you could have 10 tons per acre. So really big crop of really small fruit that has very little value. And then the following year, you can have a really small crop, maybe like 2 tons per acre, and you can get large fruit, but it's just not enough to even be worth picking. I mean, you'll see growers wanting to just leave the crop in an off year and not even bother picking because it's not worth bringing crews in. So it can be, I mean, alternate bearing is one of the another like main problems with olives.
What causes it?
Well, there's a number of factors, but with table olives, the number one thing that we see that causes it is heat during bloom. So table olives are generally one variety, Manzanillo, and it's self-fertile. So if you had Manzanillo and no other pollinizers, you can set a crop in most years, like it can self. Oh, and just to fill in the blank here, olives are wind pollinated, and the flowers are both male and female. Like each flower has both parts.
Okay.
So the challenge happens is that if you have heat during bloom, and these bloom late, they're blooming often in mid-May around Mother's Day here. If you get heat during bloom, like temperatures in the 90s, Manzanillo loses its ability to self-fertilize. And so when it's really hot, you need another variety to cross-pollinate. And so that's where the Sevillanos come in. And if growers don't have pollinizers planted within the orchard, you'll see some folks buy Sevillano pollen and actually dust the orchard with the Sevillano pollen in order to improve fruit set. And this is a major issue. So when we have heat at bloom, which happened just last year, you essentially end up with almost no crop. It's really bad. So that's the number one reason why this happens is the heat during bloom. There are other factors as well.
So in an on year also the heated bloom will affect it?
In an on year, yeah, you can have an anticipated on year. Like you can have plenty of flowers out there, but if it's hot and they don't fertilize, you cannot have a crop. That happened this year. We had plenty of bloom, and yet we did not have a strong crop.
So say there are 2 orchards. Can you plant it alternately? One is on this year, one is on that year, or do they tend to have the same on and off year?
So you could try to do that, and experimentally we will do that. We'll strip, a fraction of our trees of fruit. So we'll create off trees so that we can research them. The problem is that in a natural system, where you're growing olives commercially, environmental conditions are the number one thing that will reset alternate bearing. And
Hmm.
so what'll happen is if you have heat during bloom, it affects generally entire regions, not just single orchards, but entire regions.
Hmm.
So sometimes we'll have a situation where the southern part of the state has a crop failure, but the northern part of the state has a good crop. And, that happens, but it's usually at a regional level.
Okay. And does the cold also affect it?
Well, it can, because olives are, and here's the really neat Latin term, they're called andromonoecious. And as I mentioned, they're wind pollinated and they have male and female flowers,
Mhm.
male and female parts on the same flower. Now, here's the big but. The big but is that, about 8 weeks prior to bloom, when the buds are only visible, but the flowers are not out, a fraction of the pistils can abort, such that if there's an environmental stress like a cold or a freeze or a drought condition, so that would be sometime in March, I guess, would be around the time that if you have a stress, you can have pistil abscission, and then you're left with a bunch of male flowers. And the flowers are really small. So unless you're like looking with a hand lens and you see, oh, I don't see female flower parts, you might not even know. And I think that can really be a surprise to growers when they realize that the flowers that they have are dominantly male. So you
Hmm.
have a lot of pollen, but you can't have any fruit then, or very few fruit.
How do you overcome this?
So the only way to overcome alternate bearing is by managing the crop load. And so that means that in an on year, if you have a lot of flowers
Hmm.
and you see that there's female flower parts present and you anticipate a very heavy crop load, you would want to thin. Historically, growers would thin with application of a plant growth regulator called naphthalene acetic acid, or NAA. And they would tend to do it after fruit set, when the fruit is the size of like little pebbles, so little marbles. And that would thin off a fraction of the crop. We're doing research now to see if we can thin using NAA at bloom. And instead of like thinning the entire canopy, we're seeing if we can thin by spraying, half of the canopy or a quarter of the canopy, kind of shifting the fruit load around the tree. Does that make sense? So instead of like trying to manage it at a whole orchard level, we're trying to see if we can manage the crop at an individual tree level.
Hmm.
So that's one thing we're doing. And then the other thing we're working on is timed pruning to manage crop load.
Hmm. Okay. So, so it sounds very labor intensive. You will need a lot of crews to do all these kind of things.
Well, for the chemical thinning, it's just
Spray.
spray application.
Okay.
And
Okay.
we're testing it just going on like one side of the tree, with the idea being that maybe you can thin the crop on one side of the tree and
Hmm.
then you skip a year and then the next year do the other side of the tree, because when you do some chemical thinning, the trees do need a year to kind of recover, whether you're thinning with pruning or with stripping flowers. And so we're doing a lot of research on this right now.
Okay. And what are your findings so far? Are there anything which you can share?
Yeah. Well, first of all, again, this is like we look at historical trends versus what we do now based on what we know now about the physiology of olive trees. So historically, growers would go in after harvest and prune. And this was detrimental in terms of disease, because if you have open wounds, you can get fungal diseases and olive knot would be a problem. But it was a time when, your crews were done doing the harvest. It just seemed if you had labor available, it would be the best time to prune. But what we have found is that the timing of great vegetative growth in olive is during the summer, so
Hmm.
July and August. So pit hardening and floral development are initiated in July. So basically, once you get to July, the floral buds for the following year are being produced. So if you can do pruning in June to cut off a fraction of what would be the floral buds for the following year,
Mm-hmm.
you can manage the crop that way and avoid the deleterious effects of pruning in the winter, when it's rainy here and, the disease promoting things. So if you do pruning cuts in June to manage the crop load, you'd want to do it early in June because that new vegetative growth produces a lot of plant growth regulators, gibberellins specifically, and they inhibit floral development. So you have to manage the crop load by June.
So it's usually a month or a month and a half after the bloom.
Yeah, what we're saying is 28 days after full bloom.
Okay, okay. So that is when it should be done. Uh,
Yeah,
uh,
if you're going to use pruning to manage the crop.
okay, and that is by UCNR. That is the recommended practice you guys tell to the olive farmers.
Yes, and this research, I should say, is funded by the California Olive Committee, and they've been funding this work for about 15 years now. So we're really grateful to their support for this research.
Hmm. Any other projects you're working on other respect to olive production?
Um, well, I'm doing a project right now with a new colleague in my office, George Angelis. He's a weed advisor, and he's working on silverleaf nightshade. That's a problem in pistachio orchards, but it's also a problem in some olive orchards in my area that are in the foothills. It's a really annoying weed because it's a perennial and it persists in the ground from rhizomes. And one of the problems we have with it in olive orchards is it produces compounds that are toxic to livestock. So you can't bring in grazing animals for weed control because it's toxic to them. And also, some of these orchards are used as a multi-purpose space for equestrian activities. And so we're doing some herbicide trials to work on management of silverleaf nightshade. And that would, of course, be of benefit to the pistachio growers that are grappling with the weed. And the other thing we're doing that I mentioned earlier is we're doing a lot of work with olive fruit fly and doing some prediction modeling to see if we can find a tool that growers can use to predict whether olive fruit fly populations will be a risk based on weather patterns.
Can you mow these weeds?
So mowing is one strategy, but the major challenge is that they just come back from the
Yeah,
rhizome.
horizon.
You know,
Yeah, it's
they're really annoying. I mean, because they're in the orchard that we're doing our alternate bearing studies in. They are just a really obnoxious weed to deal with.
and does this weed is in other nut crops as well, or is usually in olives you see, or it could be
No,
anywhere?
it actually emerged as a real problem in pistachios, in young pistachio orchards.
Hmm.
As with many weeds, the problems are they're most of a challenge when the orchard is young.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, we have so many new plantings of pistachio in the southern San Joaquin Valley that, of course, it emerged in pistachio as a real problem.
Yeah. So is it a good tree for our backyards as well, the olives?
Yeah, olives are really a nice tree for backyards. And again, there's some questions that, a backyard grower
Hmm.
would want to ask themselves. Do you want a crop or do you just want the foliage? Because if you want the foliage and the aesthetic of the tree, There are varieties that are fruitless that one
Oh,
can buy from commercial nurseries.
yeah, it's hard to pick then.
Yeah, then you don't have to pick them and they don't make a mess on patios and whatnot.
Yeah,
So those
it's
are options.
yeah, those are options. All right. Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Fichtner. You talked with us. You told a lot about olive farming today, and it was kind of an eye opener for a lot of us today. And thank you very much. Is there anything in the end you want to share? You want to tell?
Yeah, so you'd asked earlier about, how much
Water
water they use.
usage.
I
Yes.
looked it up because it wasn't off the top of my head. About 48 acre inches, and that's a good foot less than, say, walnuts use. So,
Hmm.
they are a more water efficient crop.
Okay. All right. Thank
Great.
you. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much.
I will
Okay.
talk soon. Thank you. Sat Sri Akal.
Bye bye.
Bye. So, yes, and